on a rain-slicked city street. His, a billionaire at the edge of collapse and a homeless man with a forgotten genius cross paths in a single night, and together ignite a movement that could change everything. His. It began on an ordinary evening, the kind of night where the city seemed to hum with indifference, neon lights reflecting off puddles and sirens echoing down narrow alleys. Marcus Kane, a man whose face once graced magazine covers and stock market screensavers, walked alone, without an entourage, weighed down by headlines, lawsuits, and the slow unraveling of his empire. Only a few blocks away, Daniel Rivers, an engineer turned invisible after years on the streets, hunched beneath an overpass clutching a battered folder filled with sketches no one wanted to see. Neither man could have predicted that within 24 hours their worlds would collide. Not in a boardroom or a charity gala, but on the cold pavement where desperation meets resilience. What unfolded would not be a rescue story or a corporate turnaround, but something deeper, an experiment in empathy, invention, and shared responsibility. Their partnership would test the limits of power, privilege, and perseverance, and reveal how ordinary people can build extraordinary change when they stop waiting for permission and start acting together. The city was wrapped in silver fog that morning, the kind that muffles car horns and slows everyone's footsteps. In a penthouse high above the river, billionaire Marcus Vey stared at his reflection, phone pressed to his ear, the weight of an imminent scandal pressing on his chest. For the first time in decades, he wasn't sure if money, lawyers, or influence could fix what was unraveling. Down on the street, Daniel Harper wrapped his scarf tighter against the wind. Once a promising engineer, a series of layoffs, medical bills, and personal losses had left him without a home. Yet each morning, Daniel sat up near the entrance of the corporate tower and sketched inventions on the backs of discarded flyers. He had learned, painfully, that dignity is not tied to a bank balance. As Marcus left the building in frustration, their eyes met. Daniel noticed something few others could see in the billionaire's expression, the quiet tremor of despair. "Sir," Daniel said softly, "you look like a man who could use a moment to breathe." Surprised, Marcus stopped. No assistant, no banker, no advisor had said anything like that in years. They ended up walking to a nearby public park, snow crunching underfoot. Marcus spoke in halting words about his board threatening to remove him, about how his children barely spoke to him, about a lifetime of power but an absence of peace. Daniel listened, hands wrapped around a cup of coffee he had bought with the last of his change. "You built empires," Daniel finally said. "But did you ever build a bridge to yourself?" Marcus blinked. He had never thought of it that way. Daniel explained how he had lost everything, but also how losing it had taught him what mattered: humility, patience, and the discipline of showing up for people when there's nothing to gain. The two men spent the afternoon in conversation. Marcus gave Daniel his business cards. Daniel gave Marcus a handwritten plan he'd been working on for a community housing project, practical, humane, and financially sound. By sunset, Marcus had decided. He would fund the pilot project under Daniel's guidance, but only if Daniel agreed to be the public face of it. That night, news broke of the unlikely partnership. Critics scoffed. Supporters flooded social media. But more importantly, something shifted in Marcus. He had spent years saying, "I can buy it," or "I can win it." For the first time, he said, "I can fix it," and meant fixing not just a problem, but a system, a wound, a way of life. In the months to follow, entire neighborhoods benefited. Daniel moved into a modest apartment, but continued his outreach, refusing a corporate salary. Marcus began walking the city daily, talking to people without cameras around. Both men became symbols of an idea bigger than themselves, that every human being, regardless of circumstance, can bring wisdom the world desperately needs. His. The skyscrapers of New Haven glinted like polished steel spears under a dim February sun. In one of them, Marcus Vey stood at the edge of his private office, a place usually alive with the hum of assistants, analysts, and conference calls. That morning, the silence was different. It wasn't the absence of sound, but the presence of dread. An email lay open on his tablet, its blunt subject line announcing an emergency board meeting. Beneath the smooth surface of the words, Marcus heard the verdict forming. A lifetime of calculated risk, ruthless deals, and sleepless nights had built the empire he was about to lose in a single vote. Marcus had been called many things by the press: titan, innovator, disruptor, but never vulnerable. Yet in that glass and chrome space, with the city stretching out like an indifferent chessboard below him, he felt the kind of vulnerability he hadn't felt since childhood. He tapped a finger against the glass, a small sound swallowed by the city's roar, and thought of his father's old warning: power is never permanent, it's only rented. On the sidewalk 30, 7 stories below, Daniel Harper wrapped his scarf around his neck and watched office workers stream past. He had once been one of them, eyes fixed on a future of promotions, patents, and steady paychecks. Life had other plans. Layoffs, a family health crisis, a string of bad landlords. Each misfortune cutting a rug off the ladder until there was nothing left to hold on to. Now he was invisible to most people. Invisible, except when they needed a lesson in their own humanity. Daniel had learned to read people from their posture, the tilt of their shoulders, the drag of their footsteps. It was survival. It also became a kind of gift. He could tell who had slept badly, who had just received a promotion, who was nursing a heartbreak. He noticed things most people missed because they were too busy scrolling or hurrying. That morning, something about the man in the penthouse window drew his eye. Daniel couldn't see Marcus's expression clearly, but he felt a tremor in the air, a kind of static. Years on the street had honed his instincts. He recognized the posture of someone on the brink, though in his world the brink usually meant a park bench or a bottle, not a multimillion-dollar office. Inside, Marcus pressed his palms to the glass as though it might give him an answer. The empire he'd built with acquisitions and quarterly gains now looked paper, thin, a scaffolding without a foundation. He thought about calling one of his trusted advisors, but stopped himself. They would tell him to posture, to fight back, to win the vote. None of them would tell him what to do about the gnawing hollow inside his chest, the sense that every choice had been the wrong one in disguise. He whispered, almost without realizing, "I can't do this." It wasn't loud. It wasn't public. But the words carried weight, They were the kind of words Marcus had never allowed himself to say, an accidental confession floating out into the cold morning air. Daniel felt it before he heard it. Like a frequency only he could tune into, a vibration of pain cutting through the city noise. His eyes went back up to the penthouse window. He imagined the kind of problems a billionaire could have. He imagined the isolation of high places, the soundproofing that keeps not just noise out but compassion too. He didn't know the man's name yet. He didn't know the specifics. But he recognized the cry for help, even if it had no sound at all. People assume that cries for help always come in a dramatic tone, shouted from rooftops or screamed in dark alleys. Daniel knew better. They can come as a stillness too deep to be normal, a small tremor in someone's hands, a glance that lingers a fraction longer than it should. They can come from a person who appears to have everything, who built the kind of life others envy, but who feels it collapsing from the inside. Marcus didn't realize that his muttered words, his slumped posture, even his fixed stare were visible from the street, interpreted by someone with the training of hardship. While Marcus thought himself invisible behind glass, Daniel's eyes had already locked onto his, sensing the silent alarm of a human soul under siege. Down on the pavement, Daniel adjusted his scarf, tugged his worn coat closer, and decided to do something he rarely did anymore: step forward. It was risky. Security guards didn't take kindly to people like him approaching their clients. But something about that invisible cry, that faint soundless plea drifting down from a glass tower, overrode his usual caution. He felt that if he didn't move now, if he didn't at least try, some fragile bridge between two worlds would collapse forever. Marcus turned away from the window and tried to compose himself, straightening his tie, running a hand through his hair. But the hollowness remained. For years he had believed that leadership meant unshakable confidence, a mask of certainty worn at all times. Now, alone in his office with the city yawning below, he felt stripped bare, as if someone could see right through the glass, right into the hidden rooms of his mind. Daniel took a breath and started toward the revolving doors of the tower, his boots leaving shallow prints in the slush. He rehearsed nothing, planned nothing. He simply followed the instinct that had saved his life before, listened to the signals. Trust the quiet patterns of pain, step in where others won't. The cry for help had reached him, and he was moving toward it with the only thing he had left to offer: his presence, his attention, and the stubborn belief that even in a city of millions, one stranger can still matter to another stranger in their darkest hour. Daniel Harper had lived invisible for so long that invisibility had become his armor. In the eyes of the suited professionals rushing past, he was just another man on a bench, a blurred figure in a worn coat. Yet behind the quiet of his posture, his mind was alive. An engineer's mind, still mapping the world in angles and currents. Still tracking small anomalies like a scientist reading the tremors of an earthquake. Losing everything hadn't erased his ability to notice, it had sharpened it, refining his perception to a blade. Most people don't realize how much you can tell from silence. Daniel could read it like a language. He heard the city differently. Not just its clamor, but its gaps. The muffled sob from a phone booth, the subtle hitch in someone's gait after a sleepless night, the pattern of hurried steps, slowing as a man or woman weighed a terrible decision. He had learned to survive by observing who was about to lash out, who was about to collapse, who needed help before they even asked. On the surface, Marcus Vey was every inch the unapproachable figure. A billionaire with a face from magazine covers, wrapped in a suit tailored to perfection. But Daniel had seen the same hollow eyes on dock workers who had lost their pensions and on mothers who had just left family court. The world dresses desperation differently depending on wealth. But the core signal remains the same. When Marcus passed by the park bench that morning, Daniel's gaze followed him not with envy, but with curiosity. There was a tremor in the billionaire's stride, a stiffness in the shoulders that suggested sleepless nights, a faint smear of exhaustion beneath the crisp collar. Daniel knew the kind of exhaustion. He knew what it meant to live under pressure so constant it warped your sense of self. The great irony was that Marcus had everything Daniel had once dreamed of: resources, influence, a seat at the table where decisions were made. And yet here he was, looking like a man abandoned at sea. Daniel felt no gloating in that realization, only recognition. It was like seeing his own reflection, distorted by wealth but still familiar. He didn't know Marcus's name yet. He didn't know about the board meeting or the vote of no confidence. What he knew was body language, the clenched jaw, the restless hands, the way Marcus paused before stepping off the curb as though gravity had grown heavier. He also knew the sound of a voice cracking, even under the pretense of a phone call. Years of scanning strangers had taught Daniel to hear the small fractures beneath polished words. Standing up from the bench, Daniel hesitated. This was not the first time he had sensed distress in someone powerful. But usually the divide between them was too great, guarded by tinted windows and security details. Approaching someone like Marcus could bring trouble. Questions, accusations, a police escort off the property. Yet something about the billionaire's demeanor that day felt different. As if he had stepped out of his fortress just far enough to be reached. Daniel's heart picked up its pace as he considered how to begin. He had no scripted speech, no prepared pitch. He only had the gift of listening. He had to believe, that the simple act of listening could still bridge a gap between two human beings, no matter their station in life. He remembered the last time someone had listened to him without judgment, and how that single moment had stopped him from making a catastrophic choice years ago. He took a step forward, his boots crunching softly in the snow, and felt the city blur around him. Office workers streamed past, eyes glued to screens, minds already at the next meeting. No one noticed the strange convergence. A homeless man rising from a bench and moving toward a billionaire whose inner world was crumbling. The two of them, separated by every social measure, were drawing into the same orbit because one had noticed what everyone else had ignored. For Daniel, noticing was more than empathy, it was a discipline. He had trained himself to catch micro-expressions, to pick up on what people left unsaid. It wasn't about invading privacy, but about honoring humanity. He had learned the hard way that sometimes the most powerful intervention isn't advice. Money. Or rescue. It's a simple acknowledgement that someone's pain is visible, that someone is bearing witness to their struggle. Marcus, lost in thought, didn't yet see Daniel approaching. He was still caught in the echo chamber of his own crisis, the numbers and projections spinning in his head like a collapsing constellation. But Daniel saw him clearly, the way a lighthouse might catch sight of a ship drifting toward unseen rocks. In that instant, Daniel was not simply a man without a home. He was the listening stranger, poised to cross a line most people never cross, stepping out of invisibility and into the fragile space where empathy can spark a change neither man could predict. The park was an island of muted green and winter gray in the middle of the city's hard edges. Its bare trees clawed at a pale sky, their branches etched like veins against the morning light. Benches glistened with a thin film of frost. It was here, between the cold ground and the high towers, that Marcus Vey and Daniel Harper found themselves moving toward each other, as if pulled by an unseen current. Marcus had left his office in a haze, his coat unbuttoned despite the chill, his phone buzzing unanswered in his pocket. He needed air. He needed space from the suffocating boardroom with its lawyers and their polished threats. When he reached the park, he slowed. The crunch of snow under his shoes sounded like static. His shoulders slumped, and for a moment, the mask of power fell away. Daniel had followed at a respectful distance. He didn't want to ambush the man, didn't want to trigger suspicion or security. But as Marcus's pace faltered, Daniel closed the gap, offering nothing but presence. He stopped a few feet away and cleared his throat softly. "You look like a man carrying more weight than any one person should," Daniel said, his voice low but steady. Marcus turned, startled, then caught himself before barking out the reflexive, "Do I know you?" Instead, something about the stranger's tone disarmed him. It wasn't pity or condescension. It was an observation, almost scientific, and yet it carried warmth. "Just taking a walk," Marcus muttered, eyes darting toward the ground. He realized how defensive it sounded. Or maybe running from something. "I'm not sure." Daniel nodded, hands buried in the frayed pockets of his coat. "Sometimes it's the same thing," he replied. A gust of wind rattled through the trees, sending a flurry of dry leaves skittering across the path. For a moment, neither man spoke. Then Marcus, surprising himself, said, "You ever feel like the world you built is about to collapse? And there's nothing you can do?" "All the time?" Daniel said simply. "But the first step is admitting it's happening." They found a bench near a frozen fountain and sat, strangers sharing the same rectangle of cold metal. Around them joggers passed, dogs strained at leashes, a cyclist whirred by. The normal pulse of city life continuing unbothered. Yet for Marcus and Daniel, the park was a pocket of suspended time. Marcus ran a hand over his face. "You don't know me," he said. "You don't know what's at stake." Daniel tilted his head, studying Marcus not with curiosity but with the patience of someone used to waiting. "You're right. I don't know your world," he said. "But pain has a universal accent." Marcus gave a short, his humorless laugh. "Universal accent. That's a good way of putting it." He hesitated, then began to talk. Not the way he spoke to journalists or investors, but the way a man speaks when the armor finally cracks. He talked about the looming vote of no confidence, the betrayals, the mounting legal risks. He talked about his children and how their calls had become perfunctory, scheduled like quarterly updates. He even mentioned his late wife and the promises he had broken to himself about spending more time with her. Daniel didn't interrupt. He didn't check his phone or glance away. He leaned forward slightly, elbows on knees, eyes steady. Marcus noticed and marveled at it. In his world, people waited for their turn to speak or to pitch, but rarely to listen. When Marcus paused, Daniel asked one question softly. "And what part of all that is about you?" Marcus blinked. "What do you mean?" "The part you actually want," Daniel said. "Not the part you're defending. Not the part you're trying to keep. The part that matters to you." Marcus stared at the frozen fountain. He tried to remember the first time he'd felt excitement about his work. The first time he'd built something not for profit but for purpose. The memory felt faint and distant, like a radio station he could barely tune into. Daniel spoke again, almost in a whisper. "I used to build things too. Satellites, components, designs no one else would try. Lost it all. But the one thing I didn't lose was the ability to listen. Sometimes that's enough to keep another person from drowning." Marcus's jaw tightened. The words weren't an accusation. They were a bridge. He realized this man, homeless or not, was offering him a rare gift, a space to speak without judgment, to admit weakness without punishment. The winter sun shifted behind a cloud, dimming the park in a gray light. A child laughed somewhere near the swings. The sound felt foreign to Marcus, like hearing joy in a language he had forgotten. He rubbed his temples and exhaled. Daniel waited. He didn't rush the silence, didn't try to fill it with platitudes. In the rhythm of their quiet, Marcus felt something begin to loosen, a tension he hadn't even known he was carrying. He found himself saying things he had never said aloud, that he had started out wanting to help people, but had ended up serving only numbers, that he sometimes envied people who had nothing to lose, that he feared becoming irrelevant, a footnote in the empire he had built. Daniel listened the way one might listen to a piece of music, attuned to the spaces between the notes as much as the notes themselves. For Marcus, it was as if the frozen fountain, the leafless trees, even the cold bench had become part of a confession booth without walls, the park itself holding their words like breath, held in the winter air. Snow drifted lazily over the park, softening the edges of the paths and benches, covering the city's sharp corners with a fragile white. Marcus and Daniel sat in silence for a while after their first exchange, the weight of their words settling between them. For Marcus, it was the strangest conversation he had ever had. not because of who Daniel was, but because of how he himself felt in Daniel's presence. He was accustomed to being admired, feared, deferred to, or challenged strategically. But he was not accustomed to being regarded simply as a person, stripped of the armor that power demanded he wear. Daniel, for his part, understood the distance wealth could create. Years of watching people cross the street to avoid him had shown him the deep lines society draws between classes, between those who own and those who struggle to eat. Yet, as he studied Marcus, he found no satisfaction in the reversal of roles. He saw a man who, despite everything, looked just as displaced as he felt. It was a realization that quieted any lingering resentment in him. A breeze moved through the trees, scattering a small cluster of birds. Marcus followed their flight with his eyes, as though tracking a pattern only he could see. "You know," he said quietly, "I used to think success meant building something no one could tear down." He gave a half-smile without warmth. "Turns out nothing is untouchable." Daniel nodded, fingers tracing the grooves in the bench's cold iron armrest. "Life has a way of leveling us," he said. "Sometimes it takes your house. Sometimes it takes your illusions." Marcus glanced at him, curiosity flickering in his tired eyes. "You talk like you've been where I am." Daniel chuckled softly, a sound without bitterness. "I've been where you're afraid to go," he replied. "But pain feels the same on either side of the bank account." For a moment, Marcus studied him with the kind of attention he usually reserved for negotiating partners. He noticed the quiet dignity in Daniel's bearing, the deliberate way he spoke, the absence of desperation in his eyes. It struck Marcus that he had met heads of state, CEOs, artists, and innovators, but rarely had he met someone who seemed to carry their hardship like a credential instead of a curse. Around them, the park continued its subtle rhythms. A woman jogged past pushing a stroller. A groundskeeper salted the path with rhythmic shakes of his hand. Somewhere in the distance, a saxophonist played a slow blues line that carried through the cold air. The ordinary backdrop underscored the extraordinary moment, two men from opposite ends of society sitting shoulder to shoulder, not as benefactor and supplicant, but as equals engaged in a private reckoning. Marcus spoke again, voice lower now. "Have you ever gotten used to it?" "Used to what?" Daniel asked. "The feeling of being removed, cut off from everyone else." Daniel thought for a long moment, rubbing his hands together for warmth. "No," he said finally, "but you can decide whether that distance becomes a wall or a window. A wall keeps you locked in your own story. A window lets you see other people's stories. Sometimes that's enough to remind you you're not alone." Marcus absorbed the words, feeling them settle like stones in water. He thought about his own walls, not just the literal ones in his office, but the invisible ones he had built out of fear and ambition, layer upon layer, until even his children only saw a facade. Sitting next to Daniel, he felt the faintest crack in those walls, like light seeping in through a seam. As Daniel reached into his coat pocket and drew out a folded sheet of paper covered in sketches and notes. "This is something I've been working on," he said. "A housing concept. It's modular, low cost, but dignified. I think it could help a lot of people if someone with resources took it seriously." Marcus took the paper without hesitation, scanning the lines and figures. He recognized the precision of an engineer's hand. It startled him. The quality of the thinking, the clarity of the design. "You did this?" he asked. Daniel nodded. On borrowed pens and scrap paper. Marcus felt a jolt of shame mixed with admiration. Here he was, a man with endless resources, but a dwindling sense of purpose, looking at the work of someone with nothing but an unbroken mind and an idea. The imbalance between them shifted in that instant. He wasn't the savior, Daniel wasn't the supplicant. They were two men who had built things and lost things, now sharing the same thin bench in the cold. Snow began to gather on their shoulders, tiny flecks dissolving into dark wool. Marcus didn't brush them off. He sat still, holding the paper, feeling its weight. He looked at Daniel not as a problem to solve or a story to exploit, but as another human being who had managed to hold onto his sense of purpose despite losing everything else. The saxophone in the distance bent into a mournful note, hanging in the air like a bridge between worlds. Marcus thought of how rarely he'd been truly heard, how rarely he had truly listened. He realized he wasn't just listening to Daniel. He was listening to himself in a way he hadn't dared in years. The sensation was both unnerving and relieving. A reminder that even under different clothes, under different circumstances, every human being carries the same fragile architecture of hope, fear, and longing. Marcus held the folded sketches in his hands as though they were a living thing. The paper was worn and creased from being handled over and over, the pencil marks faint but precise. What stunned him was not just the detail, but the audacity of the ideas. He had paid entire teams of architects and urban planners millions to develop concepts half as original. Here, in a few sheets of scavenged paper, was a blueprint for a modular housing system that solved problems his company had been circling for years without success. Daniel watched him silently, a flicker of tension in his eyes. He wasn't used to anyone taking his work seriously. Most of the time, if someone glanced at his drawings, they would smile politely and hand them back as if indulging a hobby. But Marcus's gaze was different, focused, scanning each line, recalculating costs and materials in his head. How long have you been working on this? Marcus asked finally, still studying the page. Years, Daniel said. I started when I was still employed. Kept refining after I lost my job. Every night, every spare minute. I'd wake up in shelters or under overpasses with new ideas, jot them down on napkins, envelopes, whatever I could find. Marcus lifted his eyes. You have engineering training. Daniel gave a modest shrug. 2 degrees. Mechanical and systems engineering. I worked on satellites, clean water systems, and emergency shelters. I know how to design things that have to work under stress, with limited resources. Marcus felt a slow burn of embarrassment in his chest. He thought of the assumptions he'd carried about people like Daniel, as if homelessness automatically erased intelligence or discipline. He realized how much society conflated success with worth, is how many brilliant people were dismissed because their circumstances didn't match their potential. This design, Marcus said softly, it's good. It's not just idealistic. It's feasible. Daniel's face softened, but his posture stayed guarded. Good ideas don't always matter without someone willing to back them. He said, I've been sending versions of this to city offices for years. Never heard back. Maybe they didn't take me seriously. Maybe they never even opened the envelope. Marcus thought about how many ideas crossed his desk every week, how quickly he skimmed or delegated them. He wondered how many hidden geniuses he had brushed past in lobbies, on sidewalks, at charity galas. The thought unsettled him more than the board's threats ever had. Around them, the park shifted tone as lunchtime approached. Food trucks idling nearby, a saxophonist replaced by a guitarist strumming softly, workers on their breaks passing by with coffees in hand. The noise and movement only made the moment between Marcus and Daniel feel more intimate, as though they had stepped into a bubble where status, reputation, and assumptions couldn't intrude. You built all this from scratch, Marcus asked again, flipping to another page that showed an exploded view of the unit's components. From scratch, Daniel replied. I designed it to be built with standard materials you can get in bulk, fast assembly, and minimal waste. Each unit is self-contained but can link to others for larger structures. Solar panels, rainwater collection, insulation. Nothing fancy, just functional and affordable. Marcus traced a finger along one of the diagrams. This could change the game for disaster relief, refugee camps, even urban housing shortages, he murmured, half to himself. Daniel looked at him cautiously. I'm not Naba V, he said. I know ideas are easy to steal. That's why I never showed the full plan to anyone. But I'm showing it to you now because... He hesitated, then added, no. Because you looked like someone who needed a reason to believe in something again. Marcus felt the words land heavier than he expected. He realized Daniel had read him as accurately as he had read Daniel. The hidden genius wasn't only in the drawings, but in the empathy that framed them. The insight into people, systems, and what they lacked. Marcus sat back on the bench, papers trembling slightly in his grip from the cold. He thought of the board meeting looming, the empire wobbling. All his assets, all his power, his. And here was a man with nothing but a set of designs that could restore meaning to both their lives. Daniel rubbed his hands together, not from nerves but from the creeping chills. It's not charity I'm asking for, he said. It's a partnership. You can bring resources. I can bring knowledge. Together, we could build something that actually matters. Marcus stared at the sketches again. The possibilities were staggering, not just in terms of profit, but in terms of impact. He remembered being young and idealistic, designing his first product in a cramped apartment. He remembered the thrill of seeing an idea turn into reality. He had lost that somewhere along the way, buried under quarterly reports and shareholder expectations. He realized that Daniel's hidden genius was not simply technical. It was the genius of persistence, the discipline to keep working long after the world had stopped paying attention, the courage to protect an idea until it could find the right moment to surface. Marcus felt the tension in his shoulders shift slightly, the first glimmer of a new kind of possibility forming at the edges of his mind, a whisper of a path he had almost forgotten how to follow. The first hints of dawn stretched over the city as Marcus sat in the back of his car, staring at the glowing screen of his phone. The numbers on the overnight market feed were a slow motion disaster. His company's stock sliding downward like a frayed rope. His board had already scheduled an emergency call. Public pressure was mounting. Journalists smelled blood in the water. It felt like every decision he had made over the past decade was coming to collect its debt at the same moment. Yet, as the city awakened, he thought of Daniel's sketches folded neatly in his briefcase, as if they were a lifeline waiting to be unspooled. By the time Marcus reached the glass tower that bore his company's name, the lobby was already teeming with analysts, assistants, and security guards who tried not to stare at him too long. He moved quickly through the crowd, the sound of heels and murmured conversations bouncing off the marble. His office on the top floor felt colder than usual, as though the climate control system knew the temperature of his anxiety. He loosened his tie and placed Daniel's papers on his desk. The board filed into the conference room in staggered clusters. The CFO with his permanent scowl, the head of operations with her clipped walk, a handful of vice presidents carrying tablets. They had all seen the latest reports. Their faces were grim but hungry, sensing leverage. Marcus greeted them with a nod and began without the usual pleasantries. We're in trouble, he said plainly, his voice steady despite the knot in his chest. And we have one chance to change the narrative. He tapped the stack of sketches. This is it. There was a ripple of skepticism. One board member actually laughed under his breath. Marcus picked up the first page and projected it onto the screen behind him. "This," he said, "is a scalable housing model designed by an engineer we've all overlooked." A man living on the street. Murmurs, raised eyebrows. A few exchanged looks that said everything. Marcus had finally cracked. But he kept going, laying out the design features, the cost breakdowns, the potential contracts with city governments. He spoke not like a CEO delivering a slide deck, but like a man testifying, pushing each word forward as though it were a plank on a bridge he was building. "This is more than a product," Marcus said. It's a pivot point. We've been talking about corporate responsibility for years, but never truly committing to it. This design lets us do that and still be profitable. We can build fast, build clean, and build at scale. Disaster relief, affordable housing, refugee shelters, all within our capacity if we take the risk now. A vice president raised his hand. Where did this come from again? Marcus hesitated for only a fraction of a second. "From someone who has lived what we're trying to solve," he said. "An engineer named Daniel." Silence. The CFO shifted uncomfortably in his seat. "And what's in it for us?" Marcus leaned forward. "Relevance," he said. "We're losing it. We're seen as a relic, a giant that can't adapt. This is how we adapt." He let the sentence hang, scanning each face. They peppered him with questions. Liability, patents, timelines, risk exposure. Marcus had answers for most of them. The more he spoke, the clearer his own conviction became. He remembered Daniel's calm voice on the park bench, the way his hands moved when explaining how the units could lock together. He felt a flicker of something like purpose lighting in his chest. When the meeting adjourned hours later, nothing was settled, but something had shifted. A few board members lingered by the door, their expressions less dismissive. His assistant slipped him a note with a simple line. "You sounded like the old you." That night, Marcus returned to the same park bench where he had met Daniel. The saxophonist was gone, replaced by a woman feeding pigeons. Daniel was already there, sitting with his back to the fountain, watching the city's neon lights bleed into the dusk. Marcus sat down beside him, the day's tension still coiled in his muscles. "I showed them," he said. "I showed them everything." Daniel looked at him with measured curiosity. And Marcus exhaled slowly. "They're thinking about it. But I need more than their thinking. I need proof. I need a prototype. Something undeniable." Daniel nodded slowly. "Then we build one. Just one. Enough to make them believe." Marcus looked at him sideways. "You do that, I do it," Daniel said, "but only if you're serious. This can't be a stunt. It has to be real." The wind picked up, carrying the smell of roasted peanuts from a nearby cart. Streetlights flickered on, casting pale halos around them. Marcus rubbed his hands together, his breath visible in the cooling air. He realized that for the first time in months, he felt a sense of direction. Not control exactly, but direction, like standing on the edge of a cliff and seeing a bridge, just barely visible in the mist, waiting to be built plank by plank. He thought of all the times he had spoken on stages about innovation, disruption, and courage, only to return to boardrooms that rewarded sameness. He thought of the speeches he had given about lifting others while stepping over the people who needed it most. He thought of Daniel's patient sketches and his quiet confidence. The way he carried knowledge like a candle no wind could extinguish. Marcus's phone buzzed with another notification. A headline about his company's troubles. But he silenced it without looking. He watched Daniel trace an invisible diagram in the air with his finger, explaining how the modular units could link across uneven terrain. The city roared softly around them, horns, footsteps, laughter from a nearby bar. Yet in that noise Marcus felt an odd kind of calm. The quiet center of a storm where decisions became clear. The old warehouse on the edge of the river had been abandoned for years. A forgotten shell of steel and brick where wind howled through cracked windows. By the time Marcus and Daniel stepped inside, it smelled of rust and rainwater. But it was dry enough to serve as a workshop. The city's skyline loomed beyond, cranes and high, rises etched against a bruised dawn. This place, Marcus thought, his was exactly where the next chapter needed to begin. Not in a glass tower, but in the grit of reality. They began with nothing but the sketches, a handful of salvaged materials, and a sense of urgency that neither could fully articulate. Marcus had money, but not the freedom to draw on it openly. Daniel had knowledge, but no tools beyond what he could borrow or find. Together they improvised. Daniel mapped out measurements on the dusty concrete floor, chalking lines as straight as any drafting table. Marcus lifted heavy beams, carried boxes, and called in favors to get small shipments of steel, insulation panels, and solar modules delivered discreetly. By mid-morning, the warehouse buzzed with a quiet energy. 2 college engineering students from Daniel's shelter volunteered to help after he told them about the project. A retired carpenter from Marcus's old neighborhood arrived with his own toolkit. They came one by one, drawn not by money, but by the idea of building something that mattered. Every time a new person walked in through the wide steel doors, Daniel greeted them like an old friend, showing them where to fit into the emerging plan. The prototype rose slowly from the ground like a sculpture finding its shape. The modular walls locked into place with a satisfying click. Daniel explained how each unit could expand or contract depending on need. Marcus handled the logistics, coordinating deliveries, and negotiating with suppliers under the radar. He was learning to think like Daniel, stripped of privilege, forced to solve problems with ingenuity rather than cash. The work itself became a kind of communion. People from different worlds bent over the same bolts, adjusted the same panels, tested the same hinges. Marcus watched how Daniel led, not with speeches, but with presence. He explained each design detail patiently, adapting when someone had a better idea. He never raised his voice, never let ego guide the process. Even when Marcus's own instincts leaned toward shortcuts or flashy features, Daniel held the line. The design had to be functional, affordable, and replicable. His days blurred into nights inside the warehouse. Floodlights powered by portable generators cast long shadows over the skeletal frame of the prototype. Music played from someone's phone. Between tasks, they shared cheap takeout meals and stories of their lives. Marcus heard fragments of Daniel's past he hadn't known. How he had once worked for an aerospace firm. How his first patent had been bought and shelved by a corporation. How he had slipped through the cracks after a layoff and a medical emergency wiped out his savings. The deeper they went into the build, the more Marcus began to shed the reflexes of his boardroom life. He stopped checking his phone every 5 minutes. He learned to sand edges, mix concrete, and drill with precision. He discovered muscles in his shoulders he hadn't felt in years. He found himself laughing, swearing, and sweating alongside people who had no interest in his net worth, but cared deeply about his effort. On the 3rd night, when exhaustion had set in and morale dipped, Daniel unrolled the master plan again on the floor and pointed to a series of diagrams showing how the unit could be replicated. This isn't just about one shelter, he said, his voice steady but quiet. This is a system. If we can build it here, we can build it anywhere. That's why every detail matters. Marcus listened and saw the faces of the volunteers lit by the harsh white of the floodlights. For the first time in years, he felt like part of a real team. Not a committee or a department, but a team bound by purpose. The prototype itself began to take on a personality, a promise rising from scrap and sweat. Each component became a milestone. The rainwater capture system worked on the first test. The fold-out solar panels clicked neatly into their brackets. The insulation kept the interior warmer than expected. Daniel kept refining as they built, shaving costs, rethinking hinges, tightening tolerances. He carried a small notebook in his back pocket and jotted every improvement before it could slip away. Marcus noticed how the volunteers started bringing their own touches, a better way to anchor the base, a cheaper supplier for screws, an idea for a collapsible bed. What had begun as Daniel's sketches and Marcus's desperation had become something larger, a collective act of creation. At night, when most of the crew had gone home or back to shelters, Marcus and Daniel would sit on overturned crates, looking at the partially completed unit under the stark lights. They didn't speak much, but there was a weight in the air that neither wanted to break. Marcus would think about his board members, their skepticism, and the headlines about his company's decline. But then he would look at the structure rising in front of him and feel something he hadn't felt since his first startup, the thrill of making a thing that could change the world. Built not by committee, but by hands guided by belief. As the prototype neared completion, the warehouse itself seemed to change character. The echo of emptiness was replaced by the hum of tools and low voices trading ideas. The smell of rust gave way to the scent of fresh, cut lumber and heated metal. The giant windows, once fractured, now framed the outline of something new. A vision made tangible. Daniel moved through it all like a conductor, aligning efforts, making sure everyone knew why their part mattered. Marcus followed his lead, carrying materials, taking notes, learning how to listen rather than command. The prototype's final frame stood almost at full height now, a simple but elegant geometry of panels and beams. The volunteers circled it, admiring their progress, hands still dirty with grease and chalk. Outside, the city roared on as usual. Commuters, his deadlines, news alerts. But inside the warehouse, time slowed to the rhythm of bolts turning, panels snapping, and voices rising in shared purpose. The morning of the unveiling arrived shrouded in a pale mist that clung to the city streets like a secret waiting to be told. Marcus stood at the edge of the warehouse, looking out over the river as the first shafts of sunlight broke through the clouds. The prototype stood behind him, completed at last, a gleaming structure of modular panels and clean lines. What had begun as smudged pencil drawings was now a tangible reality, occupying space and commanding attention. Daniel arrived with 2 volunteers carrying armloads of extension cords and portable spotlights. He wore the same weathered jacket he'd had the first day Marcus met him, But there was something steadier in his eyes, as though he had shifted from invisible to undeniable. He didn't speak much. His focus was on making sure the demonstration ran perfectly. Marcus had invited a carefully selected group of journalists, city officials, and even a few skeptical board members to the warehouse. They thought they were coming to see a new prototype from his company, but Marcus had been deliberate in not sharing the full story. He wanted them to see the project first and then meet its creator. Not the other way around. Inside, the warehouse had been transformed overnight. The cracked windows were patched, the floor swept clean, and banners hung from steel beams displaying simple words. Housing that works. Floodlights illuminated the prototype's clean white surfaces. The volunteers bustled in the background, checking connections and running last-minute tests on the solar panels and water filtration system. Marcus walked slowly around the unit, tracing his hand over the smooth panels. He thought of the nights they had spent here, the laughter and exhaustion, the volunteers' faces lit by floodlights. It had been months since he felt this grounded, This invested in something that didn't revolve around stock prices or quarterly reports. By noon, cars began to pull up outside. A line of visitors entered the warehouse, their footsteps echoing on the concrete. Cameras flashed as reporters took their first photos. City officials whispered to one another, trying to piece together what they were about to witness. Marcus greeted each person with a handshake and a practiced smile, but his heart pounded with anticipation. When everyone had gathered, he stepped up to the makeshift podium, a stack of pallets draped with a simple cloth. He took a breath, scanning the crowd. His board members sat in a row near the front, their faces tight and skeptical. City officials stood near the journalists, notebooks open, ready to catch a headline. "Thank you for coming," Marcus began, his voice carrying through the cavernous space. "Today, I want to show you something that could change how we respond to one of the most pressing challenges of our time. Affordable, rapid housing." He gestured to the prototype behind him. This is a modular, self-contained housing unit designed to be built quickly, scaled easily, and powered sustainably. It can be deployed for disaster relief, refugee support, and urban housing shortages. But more than that, it represents a new way of thinking about who gets to design our future. A ripple moved through the crowd. Reporters raised cameras. City officials leaned forward. Marcus let the pause stretch, then added, "This design did not come from one of our in-house teams. It came from an engineer named Daniel, a man who has been living without a permanent home for years." Gasps. Murmurs. Marcus saw a few journalists exchange glances and scribble furiously in their notebooks. He continued, his voice firm but measured. "I met Daniel on a park bench. He showed me these drawings, and together we built this." Daniel stepped into the light as if emerging from another world. The crowd fell silent. His jacket looked almost ceremonial now. The frayed edges a testament to the journey behind the invention. He didn't speak immediately. He simply stood with his hands clasped, eyes steady on the audience. Marcus invited him forward. "This is Daniel," he said. "He's the mind behind what you're seeing today. He's the reason this project exists." Daniel cleared his throat and began to explain the system in his calm, deliberate way. He pointed to the solar panels, the rainwater capture unit, the modular connections. His hands moved with precision, drawing invisible diagrams in the air. His journalists raised their cameras again, capturing every moment. A city official stepped closer to inspect the unit's interior. "How much does it cost per unit?" she asked. "Less than half of conventional emergency housing," Daniel replied. "And it can be built twice as fast with minimal waste." Another reporter called out, "Why hasn't anyone done this before?" Daniel met her gaze. "Sometimes the problem isn't the idea. It's who's allowed to share it." The line hung in the air. Marcus felt the tension break. Not into applause, but into a focused silence, the kind that meant people were actually listening. The volunteers stood in the back, grinning. The board members exchanged looks, their skepticism flickering under the weight of proof standing before them. Daniel led the group on a tour of the unit. Visitors stepped inside, testing the fold-out beds, opening the insulated cabinets, and running their hands over the smooth, reinforced walls. They asked questions about scalability, maintenance, and funding. Daniel answered each one without notes, his voice calm but resolute. Marcus watched from a few feet away, his heart hammering. This was more than a product launch. It was a reclamation of his own credibility, but more importantly, it was a vindication for Daniel, a man who had been overlooked and underestimated. Television crews panned their cameras across the space. Social media feeds began to light up with photos of the prototype. Billionaire and homeless engineer team up to build revolutionary housing. One caption read on a live stream, Outside, more cars began to arrive as word spread. A cluster of curious onlookers gathered at the warehouse doors, trying to peek inside. The air carried the scent of rain and electricity. Marcus's phone buzzed with texts from people he hadn't heard from in years, but he ignored it, keeping his eyes fixed on Daniel and the shimmering prototype behind him. Even as the crowd moved from curiosity to admiration, Marcus sensed the undercurrent of disbelief turning into possibility. City officials whispered to their aides about budgets. Journalists began asking for interviews. His board members leaned toward each other, calculating margins. Somewhere in the din, a new future was being drafted, one handshake and one headline at a time. But the sound that stayed with Marcus wasn't the clicking of cameras or the scribbling of pens. It was Daniel's steady voice, explaining a vision no one else had dared to imagine. Until now, the glow of excitement from the unveiling barely lasted a single day before the first waves of resistance began to rise. Marcus had expected some skepticism. Every new idea carries it, but he hadn't anticipated the ferocity with which entrenched interests would move to undermine what he and Daniel had built. Headlines shifted from "innovative housing solution" to "too good to be true," almost overnight. Analysts on television smiled thinly as they dissected the prototype, their tone a mix of admiration and dismissal, as though praising a clever trick rather than acknowledging a breakthrough. Inside his company, the board's posture hardened. What had seemed like tentative interest during the presentation now calcified into skepticism. A few members privately warned Marcus about risking the brand or overextending on a social experiment. Others went further, suggesting he had been manipulated or conned by a charismatic drifter. Marcus heard the phrases PR stunt and liability, whispered in corridors he used to walk through with unquestioned authority. Daniel, meanwhile, faced a different kind of scrutiny. Journalists camped outside the shelter where he stayed, some angling for sympathetic stories, others searching for a scandal. Was he really an engineer? Did he fabricate his credentials? Old acquaintances surfaced to give conflicting accounts. The relentless speculation cut at him even though he tried to act unbothered. Marcus saw how Daniel's shoulders tightened when his phone buzzed with yet another reporter's message, how he started keeping his head down when walking to the warehouse. The backlash wasn't only external. Within the volunteer team that had built the prototype, subtle divisions appeared. Some worried about being exploited. Others feared the project would be sold off to the highest bidder. What had begun as a collective act of creation now trembled under the weight of suspicion. Marcus tried to keep everyone focused, but he could feel the current pulling them apart. In the city government, too, resistance flared. A mid-level official leaked a memo questioning the safety of the prototype's materials. Lobbyists from established construction firms began circulating talking points about untested technologies. And false hope. Council members who had toured the unit started hedging their public comments, praising innovation while casting doubt on feasibility. The project was becoming political, and politics rarely rewarded vulnerability or speed. Marcus, who had built his fortune on anticipating trends, found himself playing defense. He held meeting after meeting with board members, city staff, and legal advisors. Each session felt like another layer of armor being strapped onto an idea meant to be light and nimble. He started arriving at the warehouse later and later, drained from fighting fires. When he did show up, he sometimes found Daniel alone, hunched over a workbench, adjusting a hinge or reworking a wiring diagram, trying to improve the design even as the world outside questioned its very legitimacy. One night Marcus asked him, "Does it ever feel like it's slipping away?" Daniel didn't look up from his notes. "It always feels like that," he said quietly. The trick is to keep working anyway. The words landed heavier than any memo or headline. Marcus realized Daniel had been living in resistance for years. Not as a phase, but as a condition of survival. Losing a job, losing a home, losing credibility, yet still drawing, still refining, still believing. What Marcus was now experiencing as a crisis, Daniel had been weathering for nearly a decade. Still, Marcus couldn't ignore the practical realities. Investors were nervous. His company's stock price was fragile. The board was threatening to halt funding entirely. Rumors began circulating that Marcus was planning to resign. He fielded calls from old allies urging him to cut his losses and distance himself from Daniel. The pressure to retreat was mounting like a tide pressing against a levee. Daniel saw the change. "You're being pulled back to their world," he said one evening as they stood outside the warehouse, smoking cigarettes neither of them really wanted. "You've got a foot on the dock and a foot on the boat. You're going to have to decide." Marcus didn't answer immediately. The city's neon lights flickered across the river. He thought of all the speeches he had given about courage and vision, the slogans he'd stamped on banners about leading the future. Now, when the future had finally arrived in his hands, he could feel it slipping through his fingers under the weight of familiar fears. He began noticing how every conversation with his board started with numbers and ended with reputations. They weren't wrong to ask hard questions. The prototype was new, unproven. But Marcus felt the difference between skepticism and sabotage. The resistance wasn't only about risk, it was about control, about who was allowed to innovate and who wasn't. Daniel, for his part, continued refining. He drew up second-generation designs with interchangeable parts, simplified assembly methods, and even lower costs. He began sketching ideas for training programs that would allow unemployed workers to assemble the units themselves. If they see people building their own shelters, he told Marcus, they'll stop thinking of it as charity and start seeing it as empowerment. The backlash also forced Marcus to confront his own blind spots. He realized he had been so focused on proving the prototype's technical merit that he hadn't built the political or social infrastructure to support it. He started calling in favors from old contacts in philanthropy, government, and media. He wrote op-eds under his own name defending Daniel's credibility and the project's feasibility. Yet, each effort felt reactive, a patch on a boat that was taking on more water than he could bail. At the warehouse, the volunteers sensed the tension but kept showing up. Some nights they worked silently, their camaraderie dimmed but not extinguished. Marcus tried to thank them, to remind them why they had begun. Sometimes Daniel would give a small talk, pointing out progress, showing how each improvement mattered. His calm persistence had a steadying effect, even when the external world seemed intent on tearing them apart. Marcus started to understand something he hadn't before. That doubt wasn't an obstacle to innovation, but its shadow. The bigger the change, the bigger the shadow it cast. Standing in that shadow, with cameras and critics circling, required not only courage but endurance. He looked at Daniel, bent over his sketches, and felt a strange mix of shame and awe at how someone with so little could hold so much resolve. As the weeks passed, the resistance didn't disappear, but it began to clarify the stakes. Marcus saw more sharply who was with them and who was against them, who wanted to co-opt the project and who wanted to crush it. Each new article, each new rumor became another layer of armor over the prototype itself, as if the design were being forged not only in steel and insulation, but in scrutiny and doubt. The morning of the city council vote dawned under a low ceiling of gray clouds, the kind of sky that makes everything below it feel suspended. Marcus stood outside the council building, jacket collar turned up against the drizzle. His, watching as camera crews jostled for position on the marble steps. His phone buzzed constantly in his pocket, but he ignored it. Months of work, ridicule, and sleepless nights had led to this one moment. Inside the council chamber, his fate and Daniel's would be debated by people who had only seen their project in a slideshow or on a rushed site visit. Daniel arrived quietly, walking up the steps with a folder tucked under his arm. He wore the same frayed jacket, but had shaved and straightened his shoulders, as if preparing for battle. Marcus noticed the faint tremor in his hand and stepped closer. "We're ready," Marcus said, trying to infuse the words with confidence he wasn't entirely sure he possessed. Daniel nodded, his eyes scanning the crowd of officials, lobbyists, and reporters like a chess player evaluating a board. Inside, the chamber hummed with anticipation. Rows of wooden benches were filled with citizens, journalists, and advocates. Staffers passed notes back and forth, while cameras trained on the empty seats of the council members. The large clock above the dais ticked toward 10 a.m. Marcus and Daniel sat at a table near the front, a scale model of the prototype resting between them like a quiet witness. When the meeting began, the atmosphere was part ritual, part spectacle. The council chair banged the gavel and called the session to order. Agenda items moved quickly at first. Zoning variances, public works contracts. Until finally the chair announced, next items. Proposal for emergency and affordable housing units, submitted by. He paused, glancing at Marcus and Daniel. Mr. Marcus K. and Mr. Daniel R. A ripple moved through the chamber as they stood and approached the microphone. Marcus began the presentation, his voice measured but resonant. He spoke about the housing crisis, the city's rising shelter costs, and the need for fast, flexible solutions. He showed slides of the prototype, then invited Daniel to explain the technical details. Daniel's voice was calm and deliberate, tracing each feature: the modular walls, solar panels, water capture system, and quick assembly design. He spoke without notes, answering questions before they were asked, framing the project not as a charity, but as a tool for empowerment and resilience. The chamber, restless a few minutes before, grew quiet as his words filled the space. Then came the opposition. A council member aligned with the construction lobby questioned the durability of the units. Another raised concerns about unvetted technologies. A third suggested the project was a publicity stunt. Their questions were sharp, designed to rattle. Marcus felt his palms sweat. Daniel's jaw tightened, but he remained composed, answering with data, test results, and references to existing engineering standards. Citizens testified next. A shelter worker spoke about overcrowding and how the prototype could ease strain. A veteran described living in temporary shelters and said he would volunteer to assemble the units himself. A neighborhood leader said her community could use vacant lots for testing. Each voice added weight to the case for the project. The lobbyists tried their counterattack. They distributed glossy pamphlets warning of tested structures and hidden liabilities. They whispered to council aides about lost jobs in the traditional construction sector. Marcus watched as the council's confidence flickered between the two competing visions. The entrenched and the emerging, the known and the possible. At one point, a council member asked Daniel bluntly, "Why should we believe you? You don't even have an office." Daniel paused. "Because I've built things that work," he said simply. Because for 10 years, while no one believed me, I kept refining until I had something undeniable. And because your city needs this more than I need your approval. The words hung in the air like a flare cutting through fog. Marcus caught the shift in the room. The citizens behind them leaned forward. Journalists began typing furiously. Even a few council members who had been skeptical glanced at one another with new expressions. Daniel's quiet conviction had punctured the narrative of doubt more effectively than any of Marcus's polished slides. The debate continued for hours. Amendments were proposed and rejected. His legal staffers whispered advice. Marcus felt himself aging a year with each minute. Yet through it all, Daniel stayed steady, answering questions, redirecting objections, and returning again and again to the core promise: a safe, affordable, rapidly deployable home for people who needed it most. Late in the afternoon, after yet another round of debate, the council chair called for a vote. Marcus's chest tightened. Cameras swiveled. Hands went up slowly, one by one, across the days. The clerk tallied the results. It wasn't unanimous, but it was decisive enough to pass the first pilot program in city history for modular, sustainable emergency housing. Marcus felt the blood rush to his head as applause broke out from the back of the chamber. He turned toward Daniel, who was still sitting, eyes fixed on the council members as if making sure the moment was real. The sound of the gavel echoed again, this time softer, like a door opening. Outside the building, the drizzle had stopped. Reporters swarmed them with microphones, asking how it felt, what came next, whether they thought it would work at scale. Marcus deflected, pointing to Daniel as the true architect. Daniel answered briefly, his voice hoarse but steady, sketching out plans for the pilot rollout and training programs. Cars honked from the street. Someone shouted congratulations. A group of citizens who had testified earlier came forward to shake their hands. Marcus looked up at the City Hall facade, its columns glowing in the late day sun, and felt, for the first time, that their work might survive the gauntlet of skepticism and politics. The prototype had moved from an idea in a warehouse to a line item in the city budget, and the people who had once doubted them were now bound to see it tested in the real world. In the swirl of cameras and questions, Marcus caught Daniel's eye. The man who had once been invisible was now the center of a civic experiment. His designs no longer folded sketches in a pocket, but policy in action. A wedge pushing open a door that had been locked for decades. Marcus sensed that this was not the end of the struggle, but a shift from being outsiders pleading for belief to partners in a public promise they had forged under pressure. A promise that would demand even more courage, patience, and resolve as the next phase began. News of the city council's decision spread faster than Marcus or Daniel could have anticipated. Within days, local papers ran headlines about the Miracle Housing Project, framing it as a bold experiment in urban innovation. Regional news stations followed, sending cameras to the warehouse to film the prototype. Social media amplified the story. Hashtags formed organically as photos of the modular shelter circulated, showing citizens hammering panels into place beside the two unlikely partners. For Daniel, it was disorienting. A man who had once gone weeks without anyone remembering his name was suddenly receiving calls from journalists and invitations to speak at universities. He still slept at the shelter most nights, still walked to the warehouse carrying the same worn backpack, yet strangers now recognized him on the street. They offered him coffee, thanked him for his ideas, and asked for autographs. Some approached just to shake his hand, saying they'd seen his testimony and that it had changed the way they thought about homelessness, innovation, or resilience. Marcus felt the shift too, though differently. His phone, once a source of dread, now pulsed with congratulatory messages from colleagues, city officials, and investors who had mocked him months earlier. His public image as a billionaire who had lost touch began to recalibrate toward something unexpected, a leader who had risked reputation and fortune on an untested idea and, at least in the first act, had not failed. Invitations to panels, civic summits, and think tanks piled up. Yet Marcus, like Daniel, kept returning to the warehouse each morning, hands dirty, his eyes scanning for progress because the work was still fragile and unfinished. In neighborhoods across the city, the first ripple of the pilot program became visible. His vacant lots, once filled with trash and weeds, began to host the first modular units. Volunteers from community groups helped assemble the frames under Daniel's supervision. Following the instructions he had refined late at night. Marcus funded training sessions so residents could learn to install and maintain the units themselves, creating small teams of local stewards who felt pride in their work. Children peeked through chain link fences to watch the structures rise. Retirees brought sandwiches and coffee for the volunteers. Local small businesses donated paint, screws, and tarps. Even rival construction companies grudgingly sent inspectors to observe, curious about how the system worked. The air around these sites carried a strange combination of skepticism and wonder, like a street magician about to reveal the final flourish of a trick. Daniel's design philosophy had always been about more than walls and roofs. Each unit incorporated a communal space for shared meals or meetings. Inviting people to shape their own environment rather than passively receive charity. Over time, these spaces began to fill with the texture of everyday life, children's drawings taped to walls, potted plants on window ledges, chairs arranged in circles for conversation. What had begun as an engineering solution began to mutate into a living experiment in belonging. Marcus watched this unfold with a quiet sense of awe. In his past ventures, products were launched with campaigns and slogans, engineered for growth metrics and quarterly reports. Here, no marketing plan existed beyond human hands building and living together. Each photograph of a family moving into a new unit, each story of a veteran who now had a secure door to lock at night, became the true metric of success. Media attention brought scrutiny, of course. Commentators on cable panels debated whether this was a real solution or a flashy pilot doomed to fade. Some criticized the aesthetics of the units, calling them boxes or tiny prisons. Others accused Marcus of staging a publicity stunt to rehabilitate his image. Yet for every skeptic, there was a counter story, a nurse who could now sleep in a clean, warm space after a double shift, a teenager who had a stable address and could finally apply for jobs, a grandmother reunited with her grandchildren because she had somewhere safe to host them. Daniel moved through this new world with careful humility. He continued to mentor volunteers, drawing diagrams on scraps of paper, explaining how airflow worked or how solar panels angled for maximum light. He still wore his frayed jacket most days, though Marcus quietly arranged for him to receive a stipend from the project. When asked by a reporter how he felt about being called the homeless engineer, Daniel simply said, labels don't build homes, people do. The ripples extended beyond the city. Policymakers from neighboring towns requested tours of the pilot sites. Nonprofits called to ask about licensing the design. A major university offered Daniel an honorary position to teach a seminar on resilient housing. Marcus began to field calls from venture funds proposing to scale the units nationwide. Yet both men knew the danger of growing too fast. They'd seen projects collapse under the weight of their own hype. So they focused on deepening rather than expanding. They refined training programs, documented assembly procedures, and created simple manuals translated into multiple languages. Marcus leveraged his network to negotiate cheaper supply chains. Daniel and his volunteers tested modifications for different climates, thicker insulation for colder areas, elevated bases for flood zones. Every improvement was logged, photographed, and shared openly with anyone who wanted to replicate it. Local newspapers began reporting on the second-order effects of the project, reductions in emergency shelter costs, lower hospitalization rates for residents, fewer police calls to vacant lots, and even upticks in local small business revenue where the units had been installed. Economists took note. Sociologists wrote papers about the project's unexpected benefits for community cohesion and self-governance. The ripples widened. Pulling in disciplines and perspectives neither Marcus nor Danielle had anticipated when they first chalked out lines on a warehouse floor. Amid all this, Marcus sometimes caught glimpses of the quiet man he'd first met under a bridge, the man with sketches tucked into a plastic folder. And he saw how much Daniel had changed too. Not in essence, but in visibility. The world had shifted just enough to see him, to hear him, to value what he carried. That realization drove Marcus harder than any applause or headline could, pushing him back into the work each day with a sense of purpose that outlasted the media cycle. The evening light slanted across the warehouse floor like gold poured through the cracked windows, catching the edges of unfinished panels and casting long shadows on the concrete. Marcus stood near the entrance, his hands still coated in sawdust, staring at the rows of modular units lined up for shipment. In just months, what had started as a desperate experiment had become something living and real, humming with volunteers, plans, and possibility. Yet Marcus felt a knot of tension under his ribs, an awareness that the work was still a fragile beginning, not a completed triumph. Daniel entered quietly, as always, carrying his weathered notebook and a thermos of coffee. He had been fielding calls from city after city, each asking the same question in different words. How can we do what you've done? He flipped open his notebook and began to scribble, sketches and flow charts overlapping like the layers of his own thoughts. Marcus watched him and knew that Daniel's mind had already leapt ahead to the next iteration, the next place, the next group of people who might sleep under a roof for the first time in months. Outside, a group of volunteers had gathered for their nightly debrief. They represented nearly every corner of the city: a middle school teacher, a retired plumber, 2 college students, a nurse just off a double shift, and a father who had once lived in a tent encampment but now helped train new builders. Their hands bore the same marks: calluses, small cuts, and smears of caulk. But their faces carried something rarer, the glow of ownership, of being part of something larger than a paycheck or a headline. Marcus stepped into their circle, hearing the low murmur of voices, the laughter between instructions. He realized that the project was no longer his or Daniel's alone. It belonged to the people who had shown up, who had built the panels, tightened the bolts, lifted the frames, and fed the workers. They were the living proof of what Daniel had said months before. People build homes. Labels don't. The call to action was not a press release or a social media campaign. It was embodied in these moments. The way a nurse pressed an extra screw into a student's palm. The way the retired plumber explained torque and angle with the patience of a teacher. The way Marcus himself no longer felt like a CEO but a builder, learning by doing. The project's real power was its ability to transform observers into participants. That night, Daniel unrolled a large sheet of paper on the floor, drawing a map of the city and marking neighborhoods where new units could be assembled. "We need teams," he said simply. "Not just here, everywhere." His finger moved across the map, circling vacant lots, schoolyards, church basements, community centers. "We can't build this alone. It has to be owned by everyone." Marcus watched the volunteers lean over the paper, offering suggestions, naming contacts, plotting logistics. The energy in the room was different now, less like a charity project and more like an uprising of competence, a quiet revolution built on nuts, bolts, and human dignity. Word of mouth began to spread beyond official channels. People started organizing neighborhood meetings to discuss how to bring units to their blocks. Churches pledged land. Small businesses offered storage space. A local union volunteered to train members in assembly techniques. Community organizers developed sign-up sheets and posted them on bulletin boards, next to flyers for food drives and health clinics. Without anyone issuing formal orders, a network of action began to crystallize, spontaneous yet coordinated, echoing Daniel's diagrams of modular structures. Meanwhile, Marcus began drafting a public statement, not a corporate memo, but a manifesto for civic participation. He wrote about responsibility, about how wealth alone could not solve systemic problems, about the necessity of ordinary citizens stepping forward. He did not pitch it as a solution, but as an invitation, a blueprint that anyone could adapt and improve. Each paragraph was rewritten, stripped of jargon, until it spoke plainly and directly. He practiced reading it aloud late at night in the warehouse, Daniel listening from a nearby crate, nodding when a line landed, frowning when it slipped into cliché. "Make it real," Daniel said quietly. "Make it human. People don't need another speech. They need to hear themselves in it." As the next week unfolded, the warehouse became a hub not just for construction but for coordination. Volunteers came in shifts to answer emails, pack information packets, and prepare training videos. Marcus's staff, once skeptical, began donating their time to handle logistics. Daniel refined his diagrams into simple, open, source guides anyone could download and print. The call to action reached high school classrooms, union halls, and neighborhood centers. Teenagers began building miniature models as part of shop class projects. Retirees offered to mentor them. Local media filmed segments showing how a unit could be assembled from start to finish in under 48 hours. Residents who had once stood in line for temporary shelter now stood at tables teaching others how to use power tools safely. Even the tone of public discourse began to shift. Instead of asking, "Will it work?" people started asking, "Where do we start?" Marcus felt the difference in his own conversations with officials, donors, and activists. The skepticism was still there, but now it was tempered by curiosity and a sense of shared stakes. One evening, as rain drummed softly on the warehouse roof, Marcus and Daniel stood side by side watching dozens of volunteers move in a kind of coordinated rhythm. Some cutting panels, others sorting tools, others taping up boxes of manuals. The room buzzed like a hive, but without the frantic edge of desperation. It felt deliberate, purposeful, a movement built from the bottom up. Marcus thought of how far they had come. From a cold night under a bridge to this sprawling network of builders, dreamers, and ordinary people stepping beyond the sidelines. He thought of Daniel's words echoing back at every stage. "Why can't wait for someone else? We have to start with our own hands." Daniel, still scribbling in his notebook, didn't look up, but Marcus sensed the same realization passing through him. The warehouse no longer felt like a refuge or a secret experiment. It felt like the nerve center of a new kind of citizenship, a place where people had begun to take ownership of the future with wrenches, drills and courage rather than speeches and promises. Months after that first night, the city's skyline looked different. Not because the glass towers had changed, but because of the small, modular homes now standing in empty lots, alive with color, movement, and the steady hum of people rebuilding their lives. What began as a desperate encounter between a billionaire and a homeless engineer had become a model for cities across the country. A living testament to what happens when vision and courage meet at street level. Marcus Kane was no longer the man who walked alone under neon lights, weighted by scandal and isolation. He had become something rarer, a leader who used his influence not as a shield but as a tool to lift others. Daniel Rivers, once invisible under an overpass, had become a teacher and builder to thousands, his designs and principles traveling further than either man could have imagined. Together, they had proven that the future wasn't waiting for policy papers or speeches. It was being built, bolt, by people who believed they could do it themselves. The movement they started no longer belonged to them. It belonged to the volunteers who hammered panels in the rain, to the families who planted flowers outside their new homes, to the students who built scaled-down models in classrooms. It belonged to a public that had stopped waiting for change and started making it with their own hands. Standing in front of a completed row of homes, Marcus and Daniel didn't give speeches. They simply watched as children rode bicycles along the paths between units, as neighbors gathered for coffee under a shared canopy, as a city that once turned its back on its most vulnerable began to discover its own power again. The lesson was clear, and it resonated far beyond one warehouse or one skyline. Transformation begins with small acts of responsibility, multiplied across communities, until the impossible becomes inevitable. And as Marcus looked at the lives being rebuilt before his eyes, lives no longer measured in shelters and statistics, but in dignity and choice, he whispered the words that had guided him from the beginning. A reminder and a promise echoing like a heartbeat. I can fix it.